Hi there, thanks for joining. We're going to wait one more minute and see if anybody else joins, and then we'll start the presentation. Again, thanks for joining. Okay, we're going to get started. Good evening and aloha kako. I'm Natalie Gates and I have served as superintendent of Haleakalā National Park since 2013. Haleakalā National Park is a unit of the National Park Service. The National Park Service, along with the State of Hawaii Department of Land and Natural Resources, are collaborating on an important effort to save several species of native Hawaiian forest birds from extinction. The project we are presenting tonight is suppression of non-native mosquito populations to reduce transmission of avian malaria to threatened and endangered forest birds on East Maui. The purpose of today's meeting is to present the results of an environmental assessment, or EA, completed over this past year to address the major threats to our native forest birds on Maui, invasive mosquitoes and the diseases they spread. We will share the purpose and need for the EA as well as the proposed action and potential impacts that might occur. I hope you've had a chance to review the EA. If you have not, please follow this link. We'll put that here in the chat so people can access it. Following the presentation, we'll have a question and answer session. During this Microsoft Teams live event, you will be in listen-only mode. To submit a question at any time during the presentation, please feel free to type it into the Ask a Question box at the bottom of the page. You may submit questions at any time, and we will address as many as we can at the end of the presentation. Please be aware that questions and comments addressed after today's presentation are not considered formal comments on the EA. Please use the link in the chat to submit public comments through the project website. So what is NEPA? NEPA, or the National Environmental Policy Act, is a federal law which requires federal agencies such as the National Park Service to analyze environmental impacts and include the public before taking an action. HEPA, or the Hawaii Environmental Policy Act, is the state-level equivalent of NEPA. NEPA and HEPA also ensure that the public are involved in the decision-making process. This occurs through public scoping, which happened last year, as well as comments on the NEPA-HEPA document, which is happening now. Chris?
Thanks so much, Natalie. My name is Chris Warren. I'm the Forest Bird Program Coordinator at Haleakalā National Park. The reason we are proposing these actions is because we're at a critical moment. Immediate or timely management action needs to be taken to prevent the extinction of federally protected forest birds on East Maui. Mosquito populations, and thus avian malaria, have recently expanded into high elevation habitat, which is contributing to species' rapid decline and inability to recover. Of the bird species unique to Hawaii, the most diverse group is the honeycreepers. Out of at least 20 species once found on the island of Maui, only 6 honeycreepers remain. Of those, 2 species, including the kiwikiu shown here, are at significant risk of extinction within the decade. It is expected that the other species will see major declines in that time period as well. The purpose of this project is to suppress invasive mosquito populations with the goal of addressing the effects of avian malaria on threatened and endangered forest birds on Maui. Mosquitoes are not native to Hawaii. The southern house mosquito was introduced to Hawaii for the first time by a whaling vessel in Lahaina in 1826. The upper left is a headline from the Hawaiian Gazette from April of 1903, describing the introduction. Avian malaria, like human malaria, is a disease caused by a parasite spread by mosquitoes. This disease was introduced to Hawaii in the early 20th century, likely contained in the blood of introduced birds. Because they evolved in the absence of malaria and the mosquitoes that transmit it, native Hawaiian birds, particularly the Hawaiian honeycreepers, lost the natural immunities their mainland ancestors may have had. As a result, many Hawaiian honeycreepers are highly susceptible to avian malaria, and a single bite can be enough to kill a bird. The result of this introduction was that the native forest birds have been wiped out from the lower elevations, where mosquitoes are found year-round, due to warm temperatures allowing them and the malaria parasite to reproduce. However, some bird species were able to persist at high elevations that were, at least until recently, too cold for the mosquitoes and avian malaria. The action proposed in this environmental assessment uses a technique that results in mosquito eggs that do not develop. This technique involves releasing male mosquitoes that are incompatible with the females that are out in the forest now. When these two meet, the resulting eggs don't develop. As an added note, male mosquitoes do not bite. By inundating the mosquito population with these incompatible males, the mosquito population then crashes. The end result is fewer mosquitoes, and fewer mosquitoes means less risk of infection to the birds. The technique in the proposed action is known as the Incompatible Insect Technique, or IIT. This method employs a particular bacteria called Wolbachia. Unlike the free-living bacteria that can cause human diseases, Wolbachia only lives inside the cells of another organism and cannot live outside these cells. This is an established technique that's been used around the world, including for agricultural benefits, and has been used safely and successfully to control mosquito populations in more than 10 countries around the world, including elsewhere in the United States. The vast majority of the mosquito suppression IIT projects have been to combat mosquito-borne human diseases, and often in urban areas. The proposed use of IIT does not include genetic engineering techniques, which could result in genetically modified organisms, or GMOs. On the right is an image of an insect cell, and those large circles highlighted in yellow in the cell are Wolbachia. Wolbachia was originally identified from mosquitoes, but has since been found in approximately 60% of terrestrial insects worldwide. Wolbachia is already naturally present in the fruit flies in your kitchen and the aphids and honeybees in your garden. Scientists discovered that many different forms of Wolbachia exist in the world, even within the same host species. And sometimes those Wolbachia forms or strains cannot mix, and most importantly, they can prevent their hosts from reproducing too. As such, when a male mosquito with one kind of Wolbachia meets a female with a different kind of Wolbachia, they can't make new mosquitoes. Here in the black outline is the project area for this environmental assessment showing land management. This is the area that we analyze for the impacts of this proposed action. The project area includes lands owned and managed by the National Park Service, State of Hawaii Department of Land and Natural Resources, the Nature Conservancy, Haleakalā Ranch, East Maui Irrigation, and Mahi Pono. To orient you here on this map, this is a zoom in of the eastern portion of Maui Island. On the right is Hana. On the bottom is Kipuhulu and Kaupo. And the upper left is the Makawao area. This area is very large, and thus it will be challenging to reduce mosquito populations across this entire area. For this action to occur, implementation plans would have to be crafted by partner agencies that would determine specific areas within the project area that can be effectively treated. As you can see, most of the project area is well away from human activities and mostly consists of remote forested areas. As such, we expect the primary method of delivery for the incompatible male mosquitoes will be by air. Aerial application of incompatible male mosquitoes can be done via drones or helicopters, but we expect drones to be the primary method of delivery on the landscape scale. Drones would allow for safe and efficient application with limited disturbance to the public and wildlife. The drone model for this application has yet to be determined and will depend on performance, capabilities, and agency approval. These pictures show some of the basic body types that are available. At this point, it seems likely that mosquitoes will be package shipped and released in biodegradable packets. The packets could be then loaded into a release mechanism. The packets would then open upon contact with the canopy or ground, thus releasing the male mosquitoes. Drones would be operated by licensed pilots, likely from launch sites accessible by road. The drones would then fly up the mountain and release mosquitoes at predetermined intervals. The number of releases per flight depends on the capabilities of the drone, specifically battery capacity, and capacity of the release mechanism. The release mechanism attached to the drone could also be adaptable to be operated by a helicopter, either at the end of a cable or directly to the belly of the ship. However, given the current estimates of release frequency, we expect helicopter releases to be a temporary or short-term method. There will also be ground personnel involved in the project, primarily to monitor the mosquito populations through trapping efforts. These personnel could also release mosquitoes by hand along established management trails. However, we expect this method to be limited to small areas and less frequently than aerial methods. The monitoring is proposed at quarterly intervals and at a limited number of sites. One section of the project area in the western portion is accessible by ground, and ground releases are possible here. However, drone release is still expected to be the primary method due to the efficiency and lower disturbance expected from using drones. As part of the environmental assessment, we also considered a list of alternatives to the proposed action, but ultimately dismissed those alternatives from further detailed analysis. This does not necessarily mean these actions are bad ideas or things that cannot be considered in the future or as complementary actions. This list is just some of the alternatives explored, and I would direct you to the environmental assessment document itself for further on this topic. Among these dismissed alternatives are the use of chemical controls such as pesticides. No mosquito-specific pesticides are available, and thus broad-scale use of toxicants would likely have non-target impacts, including to native threatened and endangered insects. Thus, we dismiss this from further consideration here. There are a number of biological control products available on the market that target mosquito larvae. This has been used in localized control efforts, but application on the spatial scale we're looking at here would be challenging. There are other tools similar to the IIT technique proposed here that show promise, but those techniques are not yet available, and the birds simply cannot wait until that happens. Should some new technique become available that is better than what's proposed here, that may be considered in the future, but we feel that it's important to act now with the tools that are available. A critical element to the environmental assessment is an analysis of the expected impacts from the proposed actions. Among those analyzed here are the expected impacts to visitor use, as well as an analysis of the soundscapes or the acoustic environment. These impacts include benefits as well as potential adverse impacts. From a benefits standpoint, the birds themselves are a big draw for visitors and residents alike, and increasing populations of the birds could result in more viewing opportunities. As for other impacts to the public, including visitors to the national park and state reserves, the majority of the project area already has limited public access. Most of the state forest reserves have limited access, and we don't expect the project to impact the public's ability to access the lands. Other areas are accessed via permit only or with no public access allowed at all. We don't expect any need to close additional areas or restrict public access for this project specifically. The public can go about their regular activities. The two areas that do see high visitor use are in the Kipahulu district of the National Park and Makawao Forest Reserve. Visitors to any of the accessible areas may occasionally see drones flying overhead or helicopters transporting crews to remote monitoring sites. All aerial releases of incompatible male mosquitoes will include aircraft moving swiftly over the canopy, not lingering over any specific spot. The drones would be significantly quieter than helicopters. And finally, some project activities will occur in congressionally designated wilderness within the national park, roughly equal to 14% of the total project area. Another important consideration is impacts to threatened and endangered plants and animals within the project area. However, it's also important to note that not all impacts are necessarily negative, and we're expecting substantial positive impacts to many species from this action, including the prevention of species extinction. As for threatened and endangered plants, many of our native plants are bird pollinated, and benefits to those bird pollinators will also be a benefit to those plants. Ground crews conducting mosquito monitoring activities will be trained to identify threatened and endangered plants and provided locations of known individuals to avoid accidental damage to those plants. The affected animals, of course, include the honey creepers that would directly benefit from this proposed action, although there may be some temporary disturbance from aircraft. Other animals in the area, like seabirds and opeapea, the Hawaiian hoary bat, are unlikely to be impacted as they are active in the project area at night. The proposed action does not include night activities. These impacts and others are given much more thorough treatment in the environmental assessment document itself. Here we see our project schedule. As Natalie mentioned, the environmental assessment was released last month in December, and we're in the public review period. And in this period, we are collecting public comments on the environmental assessment and analyzing those. Following that, in February and March, agency heads of the National Park Service and the Department of Land and Natural Resources will come to a decision on the environmental assessment. And if it's approved, this could begin as early as summer of 2023. And lastly, we recognize that this would not be an easy undertaking, but we feel strongly that it's well worth the effort. The good news is that even though some species are on the brink of extinction, they haven't yet passed that brink. We still have the birds. It's not too late. We can fix this. Thank you so much for your attention. I'll now pass the presentation to Jen Harlow for the question and answer session.
We encourage you to comment on this environmental assessment. Comments or questions in this webinar are not considered formal comments. Formal comments can be submitted electronically through the project website or by submitting written comments by mail. All comments must be received by Monday, January 23rd, 2023. In making public comments, what is most helpful are detailed comments on how to improve this proposed project, or including potential impacts or considerations that are not included in the environmental assessment. Please read the environmental assessment in full and that make sure that your comments are relevant to what's being proposed in this document. Make sure your voice is heard by reviewing the project website for the detailed instructions on how to submit your comments. Thank you for listening to the presentation, and we will now open up our question and answer session. Your lines are continued to be muted, so please use the Ask a Question box on your Microsoft Teams control panel to communicate with us. I will read your question out loud. In the event that we don't get to your question, please make sure to submit it to the EA so that you can have it included. Chris, the first question that we have is, I think, for you. The question is, the EPA documents that expected accidental female release rate for mosquito mates biopesticide as 1 female per every 2,500,000 males. Why is this not addressed in the environmental assessment?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Female contamination is a serious problem that is part of this process, and reducing that contamination is an important element. The people that are looking at these mosquitoes for this project right now use a two-step process that they estimate that if 1 female per 900 million males may be released, but essentially that's scientists' way of saying that it's an incredibly unlikely event. But you know, female contamination would undermine the effectiveness of this, so it's really important that that remain exceedingly low.
Thank you, Chris. Again, if you'd like to submit a question, please go to the Ask a Question box in your Microsoft Teams control panel, and you can write your question in that way. We have an additional question. And the question is, how will the effectiveness of the releases be measured or assessed?
I can take that. This is Chris again. A really important part of this process is going to be monitoring, and we will go about that in a number of ways. There will be initial trials that help hone in on efficacy and all kinds of details that are needed, figure out, you know, spacing of releases and things like that, to optimize all of those things. But then throughout the project, we will need to trap mosquitoes and estimate abundance and local density to make sure that we are indeed having the effect that we hope we'll be having. And then the mosquitoes captured from that can also be tested for a number of different things, including Wolbachia strain and malaria prevalence. So yeah, I would say by and large, the effectiveness will be measured through mosquito abundance because we're hoping to reduce that.
Thank you, Chris. And there's another question on, I'll just go ahead and read it. All 7 Native Hawaiian lineal descendants and cultural experts interviewed in the environmental assessment expressed concerns about impacts and effects on this project could have on cultural resources and traditions, native birds, public health, wildlife, and our fragile ecosystems. Why were these Native Hawaiian concerns dismissed in the environmental assessment? Natalie, let's start with you.
Sure, I'll try to answer that. Cultural impacts are an important part of an environmental assessment. And so the EA actually includes an appendix, which is a cultural impact assessment. So it is a complete assessment on its own that assesses the cultural impacts. So those impacts were part and parcel of the entire package. They were not dismissed. They're important. So the input of Native Hawaiian communities, kupuna, and experts were all incorporated into the document. Doug, did you have anything else to add?
Yeah, yeah. Hi, this is Doug Wetmore, project manager with the Park Service. We did dismiss in NEPA and HEPA. We dismissed the we consider but dismissed cultural impacts as they didn't rise to a level that had a meaningful impact, a meaningfully great adverse impact to these resources. But we did, as Natalie said, we did produce the cultural impact assessment, which is required as part of the HEPA process. So we considered, we worked with the state extensively and considered cultural resources and had very many discussions with many people on those. So, but they are in the consider but dismiss section of the EA.
Thank you. The next question I have for Chris. Has the National Park Service evaluated the benefits of genetically modified mosquitoes in combating avian malaria? Will there be a time point in the future where genetically modified mosquitoes will be used instead of IIT?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is in large part included in one of our dismissed alternatives, because we don't think that is available right now. And so if it becomes a more viable technique, we certainly will take a look at that. And of course, we would have to do additional compliance for that technique because it's a different alternative than what we are exploring here. But yeah, we consider that technique not ready for prime time here.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, I just realized I was on mute. The next question that we have is, when can you expect to see positive results of the decline of mosquitoes? This is obviously a race against time with the KiwiQ number so low.
That's a super excellent question. This is Chris again, sorry. What we're told by the experts is that that you can see local reduction within just a few generations. But it's going to be a matter of what scale we can apply this at successfully. Of course, we're going to do it, if approved, we would do it as large of a scale as possible and in targeted areas such as really important breeding sites for QEQ. But of course, as your question implies, there are, very few QEQ left. And all we can hope is that they continue to defy odds and last until we can really get a robust program up and running to start increasing their numbers again.
Thank you, Chris. And as a reminder to our attendees, if you would like to submit a question, please click on the select a question at the bottom of the pane. You'll see ask a question. You can type your question in and I can read them out loud. Chris, another question that we've received, if this shows success on Maui, are there plans to implement this on the Big Island as well? And if so, how long could a determination take to expand the program?
Yeah, thanks for that. As I think is implied in the question, there are a number of forest birds throughout the state are significantly at risk from avian malaria and could benefit from such a program. This EA is just for East Maui for now, of course, and then there is a large group of interagency partners working together on figuring out ways to help protect and save these birds. But of course, implementation elsewhere outside of East Maui would require additional environmental assessments or other compliance. And as for timing, I really hesitate to say because it will determine our success here on Maui and then what other groups' timing is like applying it elsewhere.
Thank you, Chris. And there's another question. Genetic modification of forest birds using CRISPR technology was considered in the environmental assessment. Is genetic modification of forest birds still under consideration for the use when the technology is available?
Yeah, thanks. So this was another one of our considered but dismissed alternatives. And it's not part of this environmental assessment here. And if it were to be considered, it would have to go through its own compliance and, its own due course.
All right, I'll put another call out for questions. If you have any questions, please use the Ask a Question panel and submit your question. And I'll give it about a few more minutes to see if we receive any new questions. We have another question. Has this been used in other areas to combat mosquito populations? If so, what were the consequences?
Yeah, thanks. So this IIT has been used in at least 10 countries around the world and has been used in the United States, specifically Florida and California. Most of those have been to reduce populations of a different mosquito, Aedes aegypti, which carries dengue and some other human-borne diseases. And they saw really good local reduction in mosquito populations through those efforts. And those successes, of course, are a large reason why we start looking at it for in this context to save these birds.
Thank you, Chris. And again, if you have any questions, please submit your question. You can access that by selecting the Ask a Question at the bottom of the pane. You should see a box that says Ask a Question. You can type your question right in. Okay, I'll give about 1 more minute for anybody who has a question they'd like to submit. Okay, well, as a reminder, this was an opportunity to ask questions, but if you would like to submit a formal public comment, please do so by accessing the project website or mailing your comment in. It looks like we received one more question. Wolbachia is a long-term solution that must be continuously released to be effective. How will the park and partners ensure a viable long-term funding source?
I can try to handle that. This is Natalie. So we have lots of long-term projects that require us to commit resources in perpetuity, and the National Park Service is in the forever business. So we plan on protecting the resources we are responsible for forever. The question's a good one because this is an expensive and large project, but we do anticipate that as mosquito populations come down, that we will have fewer and fewer mosquitoes to control. So the project should become less expensive and less laborious with time. But again, we are committed. This is the Hawaiian forest birds are our responsibility, and we need to protect them. And we just don't have any other alternative. So.
Thank you, Natalie. Okay, and this is our last call for questions. If you have any remaining questions at this time, please submit them in the chat now. Okay, well, with no further questions, this concludes our question and answer session. Thank you all for attending our meeting this evening. The meeting will be recorded and posted on the Park Planning website for viewing. If you wish to submit formal public comments, please do so by visiting parkplanning.mps.gov/Hale, Mosquito. This concludes our presentation. Thank you.